Hey there, this is Joel Jamieson, 8 weeks out, and today's webcast I'm going to cover conditioning and strength. Now, this is a big topic that comes up often. I get asked about it frequently, and strength and power athletes often want to know, how do I do conditioning, or do I need to do conditioning in order to be a better strength and power athlete? So we're going to talk about the answers to these three questions, and first and foremost talk about, do strength and power athletes even need to do conditioning? And a lot of people out there think they don't, or they maybe think they do, but they don't know how, because they're afraid it's going to make them smaller, it's going to make them weaker, it's going to make them slower. Oftentimes you hear the phrase, train slow, be slow, so people think that doing anything slow or anything submaximal is going to make them slower and make them weaker. So we're going to talk about whether or not that's the case. Now, assuming it's not, we're going to talk about, are there any conditioning methods that can actually help improve strength and improve their power? Can we actually use conditioning in a way that'll make people stronger and make them more explosive and faster and whatnot? And thirdly, how can conditioning be incorporated into the overall training program of a strength athlete? And again, these are big questions that get asked. I get asked frequently. Strength and power athletes, whether it's a strongman or Olympic lifter or power lifter, bodybuilder type athletes, they want to know, is there really any need for this sort of conditioning work that I talk about often in combat athletes or team sports? And if there is, how do they do it in a way that's not going to make them smaller, it's not going to make them weaker, and it's not going to make them slower? So let's talk about that. And start out with this first question is, do they need it? And the answer is, if your goal is to stay alive, then you do. And if we look here, this categories of exercise capacity versus relative death, this was a piece of paper, a piece of research where they looked at people's VO2 max, in other words, their aerobic fitness, and they compared it to their relative risk of death from any cause, and in particular cardiovascular disease, since cardiovascular disease kills literally 1 out of every 3 people in this country. So what you're looking at here is people's VO2 max, is that categories of exercise capacity. So the people in category 1 had the lowest VO2 max, the worst fitness. People in category 5 had the highest level of fitness, the highest VO2 max. And you can see relative to each other their risk of death. So in other words, the people with the lowest VO2 max in category 1 were 4.5 times more likely to die from anything, in particular cardiovascular disease, than people that had the highest VO2 max in category 5. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been around strength and power athletes a long time, and you can certainly see there's been a lot of strength and power athletes that have, in fact, died at relatively early ages from strokes, from heart attacks, from all sorts of things. So if your goal is to stay alive, your goal is to be able to train, be healthy, and feel good, you want to have a baseline level of aerobic fitness simply because it's important to keep yourself alive and keep yourself training. And again, we can see the same thing in another piece of literature where they looked at life expectancy and different sports and activity, and they reviewed 11 studies. So this was a review of 11 different studies. And what they found was that being active, simply moving around and being active on a daily basis, increases people's life expectancy by 0.4 to 4.2 years. So that's a decent amount. That's maybe 5% of the average lifespan just by being active. And this should come as no surprise. Being active is definitely better for the average person or for everybody than sitting around and being inactive. But the interesting thing here is they looked at athletes from different sports. And athletes from aerobic endurance sports, in other words, athletes with higher levels of aerobic fitness, they resulted in an increase on average of 4.3 to 8 years of higher life expectancy than your average person. So just being active, you can increase your life expectancy maybe up to 4 years, but participating or having a level of aerobic fitness that is equal to an aerobic endurance type athlete, now you're talking about increasing your life expectancy from 4.3 up to about 8 years, or up to 10% of your life. But the interesting thing here was that it was inconsistent with other athletes, and some of the research actually found decreases in life expectancies for different athletic populations. So the bottom line here, if your goal again is to stay alive and be strong, aerobic fitness and conditioning is a hugely important component, but we want to know, how do we actually do it in a way that's not going to hinder our strength gains? So the first and foremost, the goals of conditioning should be, 1, to keep you alive so you can keep training and keep getting stronger. Obviously, if you have cardiovascular disease, stroke, or you die, you're not going to be able to train. So you've got to stay alive, keep training, getting stronger. Number 2, we want to make sure that we minimize the interference effect. In other words, we want to minimize any interference that conditioning work might have on our strength and power that may prevent any loss of potential strength and power gains. So we don't want to be slow, so we want to understand, how can we train to prevent this idea of train slow, be slow, And we want to understand, can we train or can we incorporate conditioning in a way that will speed up recovery so we can actually train more? So how can we use conditioning in a way that can be beneficial rather than negative and rather than interfere with our strength and power gains? So what we're going to talk about is 4 specific strategies to accomplish exactly that. Now, whether you're a strength and power athlete, whether you're a coach, whether you're a trainer, whether you're a power lifter, weightlifter, shot putter, whatever the case may be, these 4 strategies apply to any strength and power athlete, and that can help them accomplish the goals of staying alive while improving their strength and power, and doing so in a way that's not going to have a negative impact. So let's talk about these 4 strategies. First is you want to use concentric focused low impact conditioning methods, and you want to incorporate them before strength training sessions or in between strength training sessions rather than after a strength training session. Now there's a couple of reasons for this. First, research has shown that people that incorporate conditioning, and particularly higher intensity conditioning, after a strength training session are more likely to cause interference with strength, power, and hypertrophy gains. Typically, the research shows people that incorporate it before they do the lifting are going to have much less of an impact on any potential strength and power gains or resulting strength and power gains. So if you're going to do it, or when you're going to do some sort of conditioning work, I should say, you want to do it before the training session, or ideally you want to do it on a separate day or a separate time from the training session if you can. Now some people may have that luxury. They may be a professional athlete. They may have their flexible schedule. But people that don't, people that are going to do it, if you're going to have to do both in the same session, you want to do the conditioning work before the strength training is done rather than after it's done, if you want to minimize any sort of interference. Now, concentric focused low impact conditioning is also what you want to use, simply because it's going to cause less muscle damage, it's going to require less repair, it's going to have less of an impact simply because the body can devote more of its energy resources towards rebuilding the strength, or rebuilding the tissues that are stressed during the strength training, rather than rebuilding and repairing a lot of the metabolic type damage or metabolic type stress that can occur from conditioning type work. So things like the dragging sled here, which you see Bibiano Fernandez, a well-known fighter, doing. The VersaClimber is a fantastic conditioning tool, extremely low impact. You can use it for upper body, lower body, or total body. These sorts of things are, again, they're concentric focus. There's not a big eccentric load, so there's going to be less muscle damage, there's going to be less tissue stress, and they are low impact. So you're not going to beat your joints up, which again can take away from some of your strength and power training. If you're constantly doing a bunch of high impact conditioning, you're causing muscle damage, you're causing soreness, then that's obviously going to take away from strength training. So we can avoid that first and foremost just by following this guideline. Things like the sled, things like swimming, things like the VersaClimber, the bike, tools you can use that are going to have a low impact on the joints and at the same time be concentric focused are going to be the most important way to benefit yourself or to improve conditioning without putting stress on your joints and without having a potentially negative impact on your strength and power. Now again, the further away from the strength training session you can do the conditioning work, the better. But if you're going to put them in the same session, you want the conditioning done before the strength training work rather than after the strength or power training work. All right, strategy number 2 is what we talked about earlier. How can we use it to improve our strength and power? Well, the answer is we can do active recovery sessions and speed up recovery during the week in between our training sessions, as I was just talking about. Now, why is this beneficial? Well, simply because recovery is an aerobic process. Okay, you don't recover anaerobically. So if we can incorporate aerobic recovery type sessions into our training week and speed up recovery, that means that we can do more strength work, more power work, and we can recover from it. So we want to follow that same basic principle we talked about in strategy number 1 of low impact, concentric focused exercise. Something like 20 to 30 minutes is usually a good amount. And the heart rate 130 to 150 is a broad general range. Things like tempo intervals, cardiac output, swimming, sled dragging, VersaClimber, the same stuff I just talked about. So the goal here may not be to increase conditioning per se, but it's to get in some quality work that'll help speed up recovery. And if you do that 2 to 3 times a week, that does add up, and that will add up to an improvement in conditioning. Now the funny thing is, if you call this stuff GPP or general physical preparation, a lot of strength and power athletes will think, oh, that's great, I need to do that. But if you call it conditioning or aerobic work, they want nothing to do with it. So it's simply a matter of phrasing. It's really the same thing, and the goal is simply to improve your conditioning by improving the aerobic system, and that means lower intensity, more moderate type work, rather than slamming yourself with a bunch of high intensity in between your strength training sessions, because again, that's more likely to have a more negative impact on your strength training, simply because it requires a lot more energy and a lot more work of the body to repair tissue that gets damaged or stressed during very high intensity sessions. So active recovery sessions, if you do 2 or 3 of them a week, can act as a catalyst so that you can recover faster, while at the same time improving your conditioning and giving you the chance to develop more strength and power, simply because you can train more. And this active recovery session is something I think needs to be done far more frequently in strength and power athletes. It literally will can make a 10-15% difference in how fast you can recover from your strength and power athlete or your workouts, which means you can do that much more training in a given week and you can improve that much more. Now let's talk about conditioning strategy number 3. That's to periodize your conditioning throughout the training year. That means you don't always do the same level of conditioning throughout the entire year. To peak for a competition, you want to start decreasing your volume of your additional work, which often includes any sort of active recovery conditioning type work, 2 to 3 weeks prior to any actual competition. And a lot of times you'll see that doing this will lead to a little bit of a rebound, I should say, in strength. In other words, you're going to see an increase in your strength and power prior to competition, simply by reducing the volume of external work that's not directly strength and power. So simply put, the further out from a competition you are, the more you can afford to incorporate a little bit more conditioning work into your training program. As you start getting closer to a competition or a meet or whatever the case may be, the more you want to spend time focusing on the competitive lifts or whatever it is you're competing in. So that means you need to start decreasing the volume of anything else, and conditioning is included in that. So the goal here, again, it's you're not trying to develop the aerobic fitness of a marathon runner. That's certainly not appropriate, but you do want to develop a certain baseline that's going to help you stay alive, and again, help you recover faster and give you the ability to train more and get stronger that way. So let's talk about that. That's simply strategy number 4. And that's develop no more than the level of conditioning necessary for health, wellness, and recovery. So more conditioning is not better. You want to establish a baseline that allows you to train and recover. You want to establish a decent level of aerobic fitness that's going to be cardiovascular protective, that's going to keep you from getting strokes, diabetes, heart attacks, all the things that kill so many people, unfortunately. And again, these are just general guidelines, but in working with many different strength athletes over the years, I've looked at a couple different numbers here. The first being resting heart rate. Typically, for most strength and power athletes, to function well, and again, this is a broad range, but most of them are going to fall somewhere in the resting heart rate between the upper 50s to the low 60s. Now, once you get there, once you have a resting heart rate in that range, you can scale back the conditioning and simply perceive it more as maintenance. If your resting heart rate in the mornings is significantly higher than this, then you want to put a little bit more emphasis on improving your conditioning to get it down into that range, because again, that range is where you're going to find more of the cardiovascular protective benefits. You're going to be able to function better, recover better, but it's not so much work that's going to keep you from getting stronger, getting bigger, and getting faster. So there's a lot of genetic variance at play here. Some people can do very little conditioning or very little work, and they can keep it here very easily. Some people are going to have to do more. It's really an individual thing. People respond differently to different types of training. Now, on the same token, if you're using Bioforce HRV or heart rate variability, somewhere between the low to mid 70s is a good range for a strength and power athlete. Now, if you're a team sport athlete, conditioning is obviously a more important focus, and you're going to have a higher score. But the strength and power athletes I've seen that have had longer careers, that have performed better, that can recover from more work, that are healthier, all those sorts of things, typically are going to have a score of low to mid 70s using Bioforce HRV. So the value there is these two numbers can give you an understanding of how much conditioning do you need, and make sure that you're not overdoing it. Because the reality is, yes, overdoing aerobic fitness type work can have a negative impact on your strength and power, simply because the body has limited resources. It can only develop and adapt so much at any given time. And if you're putting a tremendous amount of metabolic stress and stress from strength and power type training, ultimately one or two or both of those areas are going to suffer, because the body can't recover from everything at once. So again, our goal here is not to develop the levels of aerobic fitness and conditioning of a marathon runner, endurance athlete, a combat athlete, or even a team sport athlete here. Our goal is simply to develop enough for health and wellness and recovery, and that's it. You want to just maintain the minimum necessary to be more likely to stay alive longer, to be healthier, and to recover faster. So more is not better. And if you find your heart rate falling in this range of upper 50s to low 60s, chances are that's where you want to be, and doing a whole bunch more work and the conditioning side is not going to benefit you. Whereas if you're much higher than this, or your HRV is much lower than this, chances are high you want to start incorporating more conditioning work into your training, whether it's before the lifts, whether it's in between the sessions, and all sorts of things. But these are some baselines, again, that I've seen over the years that can help you determine and establish whether or not you have a healthy level of conditioning or not.